Texas weather. Just beautiful, sunny, though hot day. And out of nowhere, a huge thunderstorm just came in, so I had to run outside, make sure everything was covered up and protected, because I've been doing a lot of yard work. But welcome to this week's Griscom stream. Obviously, we're going to be talking a little bit about Cuba. We're going to be talking about the Democrats here in Texas fleeing the state to try to basically just slow down what seems to be the oncoming assault from the GOP on just basic voting rights. We'll also be talking a little bit about climate change and the really nebulous way that Joe Biden and his friends and his administration have sort of refused to take serious action on that so far. But of course, for folks who aren't familiar, these are a little bit more casual and interactive. So see people are already hanging out in the chat. Always appreciate hearing what you have to say. And I'm here to answer questions. So definitely get those going. Let me see if there's anything that I missed. Some folks have been seeing these Basil Marceau clips that we were playing last week, or I guess 2 weeks ago now. I'm a big Basil Marceau fan. I think those videos are a very, very special kind of internet art that has been lost over time. So I'm happy to hear other people are enjoying those. Young Che wanted to make the point that, of course, there's really been no mention in the U.S. media of counter-protests in support of the Cuban Revolution, of course. And we'll get into why in a second, but it's all about, to use the buzzword, manufacturing consent. It's a very simple tactic here. We'll talk a little bit in a couple minutes about, why it's still really critical that American leftists not only don't fall for these kind of traps, but actually very outspokenly defend the Cuban Revolution and its idea and its project without falling into some of the kind of lazy traps that I think sometimes well-meaning folks fall into as well. And let me see. Jesus Christ, there's a branch just slamming on my window right now. It really came out of nowhere. Here we go. Yeah, I mean, I didn't get the picture, but I'm sure people have seen by now some of these early sort of debunking going on about just the proliferation of a lot of nonsense and lies about what's happening in Cuba. My favorite one being this photograph that has been circulating everywhere of what seems to be thousands and thousands and thousands of people taking to the streets and even the beaches against the regime. And it turns out all these photographs are from Cairo. If I had that prepared, I would have brought it up for y'all. Let me see. Miles says, David, would you consider yourself a Marxist-Leninist like Castro? I mean, those are two people who I read a lot of. I think sometimes trying to fit yourself into a box, and I don't even mean this as like nobody can label me kind of thing. I think sometimes getting really fixated on thinking about ideology like that instead of actually doing the actual party organizing and political organizing, you can fall into a little bit of a trap. But do I believe that, we need to have a party to win? Yes. Do I think that individual actions, while important, are nothing compared to, systematic actions of an organized working class? Yes. So take that as you will. I'm not trying to dance around the question. It's just, it's always hard to know what people mean by that. And I think especially a lot of American leftists, in the absence of a strong like socialist party or communist party to join, there's a kind of fixation where like, well, in this perfect scenario, who would I be, or like, what would I be doing in this other historical context? And I don't find that to be as productive. So I'm not saying don't read Marx or Lenin or understand the history of those kind of things. I'm saying the opposite most of the time. But I do think like trying to fixate so much on like, where am I going to fit myself into like a, historical trajectory? I don't know if that's the most productive use of our time. When instead what we should be doing is arming ourselves with the knowledge of the past and of theory and of thinkers and of successful revolutionary movements to build something that will be successful here. Let me see, y'all. Henry says, do you think there's any utility to discussing fictional ideology or fictional examples of real ideologies? While I'm a historian first, I feel there may be some use to such analysis. I mean, that could be interesting, I guess. I mean, you mean like, sort of like in a fantasy world, sort of taking things to a conclusion or exploring what a kind of political ideology might look in different circumstances. Yeah, but of course, things are going to be very, very different in the actual historical contingencies and realities that they're in. And I think that that's one thing where it's like, especially when I first became a socialist, I was really fixated. I was like, what if I can figure out and construct the perfect ideology? It's something that, when you're 18 seems like a lot of fun. And it is an interesting thing. Don't get me wrong. I'm interested in that kind of stuff in a general sense. But you realize very quickly that, like, politically, what you need to start to learn are the historical and theoretical lessons from movements of the past, not to mimic things one for one, but to understand why certain decisions were made, why they might have been correct or incorrect, depending on those conditions, and figure out what we need to be doing now. Because really, I think if you're interested in that kind of stuff, the way to think about it is like, well, maybe start trying to develop a situation where those kind of distinctions really matter. Let me see. Miles says, 100% agree. I just see a lot of DSA being afraid of communist figures like Castro and Lenin. I think American leftists need to follow the mold of successful revolutionaries to win. I think it's been interesting to see. Obviously, the Cuba situation has been a real moment that has been bringing out a lot of those tensions within the DSA. And I think I don't want to talk. I'm trying to remember if I was talking to this person publicly or not. And since I can't remember, I'm not going to say their name. But I was talking with somebody about, these kind of moments, both Venezuela and Cuba right now are good because sooner or later, a lot of DSA members, people who consider themselves to be in that kind of orbit or world, need to start taking these questions a little bit more seriously. And these kind of big historical moments like we're in right now sort of push people to finally make a decision, and it allows us to sort of push back against some of the more latent and toxic, anti-solidarity politics that we see from some folks who consider themselves to be socialists. I think everybody is, for the most part, is reachable. You have to remember that if you grow up in the United States, you have been just fed lies and misinformation for such a long time that, there's a lot of work that has to be undone and, like, positively, I'm saying this as comrades, and friends and stuff to one another, like, positively, like, undoing a lot of that kind of propaganda is something that we have to undergo, and, just understand that it's growing pains. I also think it's important too to make sure that just because you learn that, everything I've learned, just because you start to realize that so much of what you have learned or the way that you view the world is wrong, don't allow that to give you an excuse to have like a lazy counter narrative, right? Or just like, okay, well, what is the opposite of what I've been taught? That must be the truth, right? And I see some people fall into that trap too. Understanding the world is difficult, but much more important than anything is making correct action, and starting to think seriously about other countries and other historical moments really does require the patience to, one, say, okay, I've been fed a lot of misinformation, and two, just because I'm going to reorient my politics and my way of viewing the world doesn't mean that I can just take a kind of like lazy counter position to everything, like conventional wisdom. Does that make sense? I don't know. I hope it did. J. Andrew World says, my birthday is tomorrow. Can I get a shout out, brother? Of course, man. Happy birthday. Hope you've got something nice planned out. Definitely, people should definitely check out J. Andrew World and all of his projects. He's a good guy, for sure. And thank you so much, Kowalski, for showing up with the super chat there. And, we got some good ones in the chat here coming up. Haas Bossman says, how can public school teachers radicalize students now that we can't even teach critical race theory anymore? I know. I mean, it's difficult. So much of our education system was fixated on, teaching people legal discourse, right? And now we can't do that anymore. I'd love to have a longer conversation on critical race theory because, as I'm sure most people listening to this show right now know, it's one of the most absurd conversations. Obviously, the GOP and the Republicans who are trying to ban its teaching in schools have no real conception of what it is. And it's funny when you have a kind of topic of conversation that's like invigorating the discourse, but nobody can really pin down what they're talking about. You do get these kind of weird defenses of critical race theory in the sense that like what they're attacking is not proper like legal discourse. But you have people being like, well, this, I'm going to make a full-throated defense of this. And it's like, well, the point is that they're coming after a boogeyman. And I think exposing that they're coming after a boogeyman is where to engage with them. Let me see. Yeah, and Henry says on the question of like fiction and ideology, that's been their thinking on it as well. I don't know who would challenge Biden in the primary, and I think that kind of tactic that some people are going to have to learn is that, it was Bernie, and it was only Bernie who was worth building a socialist movement around. It really, 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 like, let's not fall into a trap. Somebody said, Michael said, the left should challenge Biden in the primary. I don't know if anyone will step up. I mean, what I'm saying is that I think it would be great for Biden to have a challenger from the left. But really, when you look at like the political field, I mean, it was Bernie. And what we have to actually do is start paying attention to building up political power elsewhere than these kind of Hail Marys at the White House. That's going to just waste a lot of resources for us going forward. And it's going to lead to a lot of confused politics. Bernie really was the cheat code, because you had somebody who was genuinely operating from a socialist perspective, or at least from some shared tenets of socialist thought. You start spending our time just like defending like wishy-washy progressives who like want to defend a more progressive version of capital. If you want to make that the socialist project of us in the next 10 years, we'll lose all of this momentum. Because remember, I mean, we're in this really difficult position because we're not even close to power, but the real fight begins on the other side. Let me see, y'all. Yeah, somebody says it's a mobilization strategy. I don't think they really care much if they're successful at banning CRT, to be honest. Of course, it's just it's culture war stuff. It gets them super worked up. Well, yeah, let me get to some of these stories. I definitely want to get to these questions. So, well, just to acknowledge this, MIDI doctor, says Left Reckoning. What do we do if Biden doesn't come through on Infrastructure Act, PRO Act, People Act? What's the plan? I mean, I think that's already the case. I mean, the plan has to be that we can't rely on these people, and we'll get into that, like especially regarding Texas, and the Texas Democrats sort of fleeing the state right now. We can't rely on the Democratic Party here. I mean, this stuff is getting extremely serious. I know, like, I would love to have, like, here's the one parliamentary trick we have to sort of, like, fix this thing. But the real thing that we need to start doing is to start organizing ourselves in a more cohesive fashion, that we're able to flex our muscle as a political category, and hopefully eventually as a political class the working class. We're not there right now, and this isn't trying to be a cop-out kind of thing. It's like we right now, what we do is we analyze politics, right? And we watch politics, right? And that's good. This is how you build consciousness. But we need to be in the position where we're able to be influencing it and doing politics. And the point right now is the Democratic Party has no reason to worry about the burgeoning socialist movement, let alone the progressive movement. And, there's ways that we can start to challenge them individually. But to be able to do that effectively, we're going to have to start uniting folks. So it's not just like small groups in Los Angeles putting up a progressive challenge against, a congressperson they don't think is representing them, right? Like, we have to start to build those organizations. And that's effectively the hope of organizations like the DSA. But there's just a tremendous amount of work to be doing. And it's really important, even though short-term stuff is very, very important and present in our lives, we just have to be able to take the 2 to 5 to 10 year perspective on things too. I wanted to shout this out to start and start to show people, though, because even though it's seeming more and more apparent what the Biden administration is going to be, there has been this very exciting, this has nothing to do with Biden, but this moment that we're in, there has been this really exciting growth of more and more labor militancy. And I just wanted to shout out another big strike that's going on. Let me get this up for y'all. Oh, you know what? Hold up one moment, because I'm going to have to add my microphone or you won't be able to hear me. I'm sorry, y'all. I'm still, I think we're going to use a new program soon, because this one, for me at least, is not the best. But there's a big strike going on right now in Kansas. I'm going to pull up this article in one moment, but I just want to make sure that I can talk while I'm reading it to y'all. Damn it. My apologies. Oh, here we go. Input, not output. Yeti microphone. All right. Let's see if this works. Of course, now it's not going to work. Okay, let me do this then. Hold on. Okay, here we go. Sorry about that, y'all. Workers strike for higher wages and less overtime at Topeka Frito-Lay plant. In Topeka, Kansas, more than 500 workers went on strike at the Topeka Frito-Lay plant this week, demanding higher wages and limited hours. Strikers picketed outside a warehouse entrance, hoisting signs that mocked Frito-Lay, branding like Chester Cheetah, and pressed for public support for pay hikes and less overtime. Why can't I get a day off, says Charles Taylor, who operates the machines that process Doritos and Tostitos. We can't even get one day off. How does that make sense? A machine shouldn't be treated better than their employees. Which, this has been a regular theme now. We saw it regarding Amazon too. The mechanization of labor, the dehumanization of labor, it is becoming a real sticking point, not just the kind of, metaphor for the way people are treated. People are really recognizing how human beings are being treated and turned into machines by the system, which is a critical realization. It's an old one, but it's a critical one for sure. A union membership rejected a contract offer from the company, saying they included 2% wage increases were too small. The increase for many workers would be less than 50 cents an hour. And this is good right here, is workers like Tracy Johnston, who's been at Frito-Lay for 30 years, say they've been long overdue for significant raises. Milk's gone up, meat has gone up, everything's gone up, she said, but our wages have stayed the same. And, this is, as we're seeing, despite all of these kind of narratives that the economy is back on track, and we're entering into the Biden boom, many working people are being left behind. And there's there's a lot of mobilization going on right now with labor across the country. And this is a really exciting example of it. We're already seeing that the strike is working. I didn't prepare them, but I've been seeing images that, there have been shortages of Frito-Lay products in the areas around Kansas. So it's definitely an exciting development there. And this is to go back to the question earlier about, what should we be doing about Biden? It's like, this is the kind of support that we need to be doing, and trying to find ways to channel all this labor militancy that we're starting to see, and to channel that into more permanent organizations or at least connections with one another, so that we can realize that these political fights aren't just located at your one shop floor in Topeka, but they're very much shared across the country, right? And that's the kind of consciousness that we have to be building, because as I was talking about, I think a couple of Griscom streams ago, the fact that the right wing is so reliant right now on culture war is very scary and dangerous, because they can do a lot of horrible damage to people. I'm talking about the attacks on trans folk, the attacks on people's right to vote, the attacks on critical race theory and shit like that. We can laugh at them because they're obviously absurd, but these are, there's intention behind them that could be quite dangerous. So it has to be opposed on its own right. But also the fact that the right wing is so reliant on doing this right now, I think, sort of shows that there's a kind of weakness in their politics right now. One that the Democratic Party has been completely unable to respond effectively to, but hopefully could be an opportunity for us. We got the how many Texans in the chat? I would love to hear that out. Texans, show yourself. Well, let me see, y'all. Should we do Cuba first, or should we do this Texas story? There we go. The Texans are showing up. I love it. All right, we're going to do Texas first, the way that it all began. All right, well, we got to talk about this. I mean, I teased it. It's obviously it's a big story. The fact that folks in Texas Democrats have left the state now. Abbott called a special session to basically put forward a whole trough of really nasty right-wing fantasies. Most notably and dangerous is severe restrictions on the right to vote. And there is just no way to frame this, that makes the Republicans look like a sane, organization. I mean, the claims that this is about voter, about the integrity of the vote and making sure that there are no illegal votes cast is just absurd. Voting in this country is a pain in the ass. Even if you care and you pay attention to this stuff, going through that process sucks. Most people also have the recognition that just because of the sheer number of folks in this country, that most people feel like their vote doesn't matter. The idea that we're facing some kind of unprecedented voter fraud epidemic in this country is absurd. It's a complete fantasy, and everybody knows it. Everybody knows it. It doesn't matter how much all of the Republican arguments about this kind of thing, right, are just saying like, well, these are just common sense solutions. And if you need a license to drive, shouldn't you need one to vote, blah, 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 right? They can never effectively make the case that there is rampant voter fraud in this country, right? They just fail at that test time and time again. And, it's clear. And everybody knows it. So, they're pushing through this extremely, extremely draconian anti-voter bill here. And the Democrats, around 50 of them in the House, have left the state to prevent there being, a final vote, to prevent there being quorum that would be necessary to basically enact this law and to send it to Abbott for signature. It looks like the Senate won't be a problem, but it looks like they have enough folks who have left from the House that they won't be able to hold these votes. So the folks have left and they've gone to Washington, D.C., where they're now trying to lobby Congress, notably the Democrats, to pass the For the People Act and to ensure that the federal government prevents these kind of egregious assaults on voting rights. This is something, this story is one that's extremely, extremely clear what's going on here. the GOP, much like the Democratic Party in states that it controls, is trying to make sure that it can manage and control democracy, to make sure that the voters who are voting are the voters they want to be voting, and also to be able to uphold their extreme regime of gerrymandering. The fact that the Democrats successfully left the state of Texas, and just for people who aren't familiar, basically they've left. They're not showing up into the Capitol, so basically they can't hold the votes that are necessary. And also they've left the state, because the state, and this happened, everyone was expecting it, but basically a couple hours before we went on, Texas has now sent out orders for the arrests of the Democratic lawmakers who have left, to basically compel them to return to the state capitol so that they can have quorum and hold these votes. But because they've left the state, now the Texas government does not have the authority to chase them across state lines. So what we're seeing right now is going to be a mass lobbying campaign of the Texas Democratic Party to a national Democratic Party that seems to care less. Like they could not care less, excuse me, about the plight of Texans when it comes to vote, except if they can use that as a fundraising mechanism. And that's the thing that's so despicable about this moment, is this has been ongoing for a very long time. And I have a lot of criticisms of the state Democratic Party too. We'll get to those in just a moment. But basically, and Ajam, just so I can respond to this, says, did they need to leave to avoid getting arrested? I mean, essentially, and I don't know if arrest is the technical legal term, but they basically be compelled by state troopers to enter into the hallways of power here in Texas. So that's why you leave the state, so that you basically prevent the legislature from being able to function, because it's not able to have enough representatives to hold these votes. And Prairie Fire says, I'm cleaning out a cattle trailer. Could you speak up? I can barely hear you over the pressure washer. So this is a pretty, interesting moment. Obviously, it's a big political theater moment. But let's talk about what really matters here, right? It's interesting if you if you're somebody like me who reads the news and follows these things, oh, well, this is a different kind of thing. Let's talk functionally what this is. This is not a long-term solution to this problem. The Texas state Democrats are essentially saying the exact same thing, that they can't do this forever. It's a good reminder, by the way, about how absurd these state government systems are when it comes to paying people. You basically make no money as a representative here in Texas, which means that pretty much everybody else has a second job, which in my opinion is just a huge opportunity for rampant corruption, and is very much an anti-working class move as well, because it basically means that only people who have secure enough income and the kind of job that they can leave regularly are able to serve as representatives here. I think that, I don't think that people in politics should be making, millions and millions of dollars, but it's one of these things where it's very, very clear. When you underpay politicians, you basically open up the door to corruption, and even worse, you basically close the door on working class people. So all of these folks are in D.C., and we'll see how long they can last. And basically, they're going to try to last until the end of this special session. But Abbott's already come out very clearly that they'll just do it again, and they'll just call a special session of the Texas Ledge again and again and again and again until they are able to put this through. So the strategy for the Texas State Party when it comes to the Democrats is just to hopefully run out the clock and hope that the federal government acts. And that's the kind of the problem that we're facing right now, is despite this speech, and I'm sorry, the what I'm using right now to stream doesn't allow me to share video with sound. Biden's speech that we saw today, where he basically stood up strong for voting rights, was the exact same kind of shit that we've been seeing from Biden from the get-go. which is a lot of rhetoric, a lot of, we're going to restore the soul of America. And for those people who don't want to stand up for America, shame on them, right? This kind of thing that gets suburban folks who ended up showing up for Biden in the suburbs of Atlanta and Dallas. It gets them fired up about the idea of a return to civility, but functionally means nothing when the Democratic Party is so disorganized that it can't even pass through basic voting protection laws, despite the fact that it controls the House and the Senate. It's a joke that we're in this position in the first place. It's an absolute joke that this party is functionally unable and unwilling to make the kind of political calculations necessary to do something that should just be a slam dunk politically at making sure that people have the right to vote. So we'll see what happens. But I'm going to tell you, I would love to be wrong on this. But what I have the feeling is coming is a lot of really compelling fundraising narratives. Maybe some merch, right? And a lot of inaction on things that they definitely could be doing to protect the right to vote. Miles says Texas Dems need to occupy Pelosi and Schumer's offices to nuke the filibuster to pass H.R. 1. Yeah, that's definitely would be the hope. That they would be doing something like that. I will say it's interesting to see the bluster. Beto, who is a master of kind of like symbolic fireworks in his rhetoric, is he's getting all pink in the cheeks in his interviews with Texas Monthly about how pissed off he is at the National Democratic Party. We'll see how long that fervor lasts. This is something that they definitely could be doing and would be in their goddamn interests to do. But effectively, the Democratic Party under Biden, especially in regards to the Senate, has really sold themselves out on this idea of bipartisanship, and that's going to get into infrastructure stuff as well. Javier says, what's your favorite kind of symbolic #resist merch? I don't know, but y'all should put together a list of that. I'd love to see some of the best ones of that. Before we move on from Texas, I just wanted to say, right now, it's good to see that the Texas Democratic Party is at least trying to do a little bit of something. But they never should have been in this damn position in the first place. People forget how giddy that they were, that there was going to be this huge pendulum swing regarding the Texas legislature for the Democratic Party. And it's something that has not been talked enough about the Biden victory. It was that relying on this kind of southern suburban strategy that was so critical for Biden's victory basically handed over state governments across the country to the Republican Party. And what I mean by that is Biden basically ran on a campaign of platitudes and on civility and all this kind of stuff that does not motivate voters. And the hope was that they would just be able to pull enough Republican voters from suburban districts that they could maybe tilt it in Biden's favor. And in Texas, it was a disaster. You had about like 9 people who threw their hat in the ring to be speaker here that were Democrats a week before the election, right? They were preparing their campaigns publicly because they were like, we're going to win this election clean and clear and overwhelmingly. And they underperformed, not only by those bold predictions, but they lost power here. It's a joke. And we should never have been in this position in the first place. And that was a purposeful decision to continue to run on this bullshit of symbolic politics and civility, despite the fact, when you talk to, when they were doing kind of early exit polls of some of the places in Texas that surprised in 2020 because Trump picked up votes with, people of color and working class people, some of the number one things was that He sent us money, and I like that. That helped me out, right? And it's the kind of thing that, you can sit and be all as right as you want about it here and be like, well, actually, Congress did, and blah, 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 and Trump was a horrible, and he was, and you're right. But the Democrats didn't run on that. They did not run on the idea that they were the party that was going to provide more and more economic relief in a material and tangible way to people. And instead it was, we're the party that cares about people. We're the party that's nice. We're the party that follows the rules. And you know who liked that? Was people who make $180,000 plus and live in a nice house with an HOA. It did nothing to motivate people to show up for them. And it's extremely despicable when you know how much is on the line. Because there's a shitload that's on the line in every election everywhere, but especially in Texas. Right? Especially in a moment where you thought that there was going to be enough mass mobilization that something different was going to happen. And I want to note this because there's going to be a lot of focus on these folks who flew out to D.C., and I think it's good that they did it, and I think that the National Democratic Party needs to get their damn act together and support and defend voting rights across this country. But you know the kind of people that are going to be forgotten in this kind of fight are folks like this man right here. A Houston man is arrested for alleged illegal voting as Texas GOP seeks tighter laws. And this is Ken Paxton's disgusting, monstrous fixation right now here in Texas. But when Hervis Rogers went viral on social media for being the last person in line at Texas Southern University to cast a vote at 1 a.m. on Super Tuesday in March 2020, he was applauded as a tenacious, civic-minded man who worked hard to exercise his right to vote. Now Rogers is being prosecuted by Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton's office for allegedly voting illegally. The arrest came just one day before the Texas legislature convened on Thursday to begin a special session where a controversial voting bill is on the agenda. In 1995, Rogers was arrested and sentenced to 25 years in prison for burglary and intent to commit theft. He was out on parole May 20th, 2004, and his parole was set to end June 13th, 2020. Rogers was one of millions of people in America without the right to vote because of laws in a number of states, including Texas, prohibiting formerly convicted felons from participating in elections while still on parole. Rogers was arrested on Wednesday in the South Acres neighborhood in Houston, and he voted in Harris County, but the Attorney General's office is prosecuting the case in Montgomery County. Rogers is charged with 2 counts of illegal voting. His bail is set at $100,000. It's absolutely despicable to see the targeting of this individual for political gain for a pig like Paxton. And it's a moral imperative that the GOP is thrown into the dustbin of history. And it infuriates me, the callousness and the evil that they represent, and just the complete feebleness of the opposition. All right. Let me see if I miss any questions in the chat. I would love to take some questions. We got to talk Cuba, and we'll talk a little bit about Biden. I just wanted to note we're going to be talking tomorrow on the show, which is at 7 Central with Matt Leck. We're going to be joined by Victor Puggi to talk about Bolsonaro and Brazil. We weren't able to get that up for patrons just because so much had happened over the weekend that we figured it would be better to do a live interview instead. So that'll be for everybody tomorrow at 7 Central, along with a lot of other stories as well. Let me see. Yeah, Miles says this is why we have to expunge the GOP from this country. It's a joke, and it's frightening, especially what happens when the kind of right flank of the GOP is running against the people in power right now who are already monstrous enough. And when you don't even have a competent opposition, right? I'll tell you who's not going to do it. It's not going to be Beto. And I think that fantasy needs to stop. That ship has sailed. The cool skateboarding boy is not going to be the one who delivers nice little platitudes. Is not going to be the one that's going to be able to to invigorate this state. I think we need something very, very different. And I think we would need somebody who is talking about things that are able to push through culture war stuff. I'm sorry. Beto's stuff about taking everybody's guns, he's DOA, dead on arrival. You need somebody who's going to be able to invigorate a working class that has been left behind by the GOP and the Democratic Party for far, far too long. Comrade Lone Star is at work, serving the masses right now. I love it. I always love when people are listening to Left Reckoning at the work, at the workplace. James World wants to know if there's on the ground movements in Austin organized against the Texas legislature. There've been there's been rallies and things like that. I don't think anybody's planning on occupying the Capitol as it is. The absence of people shutting down that system enough. Miles wants to know, is Pedro Castillo actually going to be the next president of Peru? Looks like it. We're hoping for. Can't take our eye off the ball while they're still crying election fraud, but it's looking solid. The Dems in Texas are fine and all, but what I ask myself is the question, why is there no third party? Well, that's the question everywhere in this country, and there's a lot of historical reasons as to why, mainly that there's been a complete shrinking of democracy. And honestly, this is a good transition. It's amazing because let's talk about Cuba. I have Matt and I are going to be interviewing Andrew Hartman in about half an hour, so I have to go in a little bit. That will be up for patrons, I think, early next week. We're going to be talking about the culture war. I'm really looking forward to that. But it's funny to talk about this fight about voting in this country. And it's sort of a perfect transition to talking about Cuba. Because the way that Cuba is presented in this country is a super anti-democratic society. And if only they had American freedoms. Freedoms like Hervis Rogers is enjoying right now, being attacked by the government for trying to vote in a presidential primary, right? That's freedom. That's democracy. It's just such an absolute joke, the kind of propaganda there is against Cuba today. And we have to talk a little bit about it. I'm sure we're going to do an in-depth segment again because it's worth it to confront this propaganda as much as possible. But let's talk, just for people who aren't familiar. I'm sure people have seen, at least rumblings of this, but let's just get the facts straight, and then we can sort of do some analysis. In Cuba, there have been some protests of people who are expressing dissatisfaction with the government, dissatisfaction with the fact that they're hungry, dissatisfaction with the fact that the economy has been struggling in Cuba, dissatisfaction that there have not been access to all of the medicines and medical equipment that is necessary, right? And these things these protests have been completely overhyped in the West, right? They have been overstated their size. They have been overstated in the demands, right, in the United States. But they are happening. And I think, yes, it would be accurate to say that there are certainly American interests involved. There are certainly money that is floating around there. But I think it's also important not to fall into this trap of just saying it's not happening, because it is, right? And I think what you have to do is to be able to talk about the scale and what it's about. So we'll get to all that in a second, just to give people the rundown of events. There were some police arrests, which I think is something that we can very easily, say is not good. I think it's very obvious, too, that it's absurd for the United States or people in America to be talking about that kind of thing after what we've seen last year, or how any year in America when it comes to our right to freedom of assembly always being sort of squashed on by police departments. But yes, these things are happening. And what I'm trying to point out right here is that we can even give them, these things, and we can make the point that this is one completely overhyped. This is very much an attempt to attack the government and to weaken the Cuban Revolutionary Project. And I'm going to get to the source of all of the discontent in one moment, because this is the main thing that has been completely missing in American media, including in a lot of like left liberal spaces, which is that almost immediately after these protests go into effect, there were massive counter-protests in defense of the revolution, right? And this is something that is completely ignored in the American press to create this narrative that the people of Cuba are rising up and they're demanding freedom and they're demanding Joe Biden come in and overthrow the government. That's not the case. People saw this threat from people, from their neighbors, from people in their community who were protesting against the government, and they said, no, not in our land, not in our name. We stand with the revolution. We stand with this project, right? It's very clear what has come out now, that some folks are dissatisfied, but the vast majority of people recognize the historical moment that they are in. They recognize the importance of the Cuban Revolution and the continuation of socialism on the island. And they won't allow any kind of attempts like this, weak attempts like this, to disrupt that. Remember that in Cuba in 2019, there was a massive referendum that codified a new constitution, right, which included some reforms, some easing of restrictions that had been put into place on the island. But along with that was a commitment to socialism. And that had the support. It won that election with 90% of the vote. When was the last time that you were asked or consulted on the American Constitution, a document that has been used to uphold some of the most wicked evils against people on this continent, right? When were you asked anything like that? What we're seeing right now in Cuba is a hope of the opponents of the revolution that by starving out the people, you can create a narrative that will allow people in this country to accept American intervention. That's it, plain and simple. There are no ifs, ands, or buts about it. What's happening right now is there's some dissatisfaction because there are economic problems on the island because of COVID-19 and the American embargo, which has cost the country over $130 billion. There are shortages of key medical equipment. The Cubans, recognizing that Biden certainly would be pursuing what the Democrats like to call vaccine diplomacy, recognized that they needed to produce their own vaccine. And they produced their own vaccine that is remarkably effective, around 92% effective. But there are shortages of the needed medical equipment to be able to produce enough of the vaccine to vaccinate the entire population. And that's a fight that's ongoing. And that's a fight that is caused not because of the greed or the incompetence of the Cuban regime, the Cuban government. That's a crisis that is caused because of the wickedness and the evil of the United States. The United States still choking this island off from the rest of the world. Biden comes into power in a moment of global crisis with the history, when he was the vice president under Obama, of easing tensions with Cuba, and instead has upheld the monstrous Trump attacks on the island. That's the Biden legacy. And in this moment, when it's very, very clear that the people of Cuba do need a respite from this onslaught of American empire, you're seeing doubling down from Joe Biden. It's just so fundamentally clear. And the point of the sanctions is to get people to be so desperate that they would say something along the lines of, we will welcome an end to our revolutionary project if I can get food, right? That's the cruel idea of the sanctions, right? If you get people hungry enough, you break their will and you break their resolve, right? If anything, what you're seeing is the sanctions working on some folks, but it's not enough to break the majority's will. And it's our role and our responsibility as Americans to break the American sanctions on Cuba, to fight against them as much as we can, and to not make this a kind of trivial issue or like a cottage, like an issue that only is of interest to a few folks, right? These sanctions kill people. These sanctions are monstrous. These sanctions have prevented the Cubans from expressing their own democracy and their own independence, and may I say their own freedom to choose the world and the society that they want to live in, that they want to build, right? The American war on the Cuban people has prevented them from being able to express themselves democratically or to express their own freedom, because there is no freedom for hungry people. It's I want to get. There's a lot I have to say about that, and I'm sure I'll have another opportunity to do it too. I know Joe Snuffy wanted to note that Gina, who's in the Biden administration, has been talking about problems when the administration doesn't secure $400 billion for elder care. As scary as she is building consent for privatizing Social Security. That's definitely worth noting and worth and something we should all be watching closely. Because I know the Democratic Party would love to be the party that provides, Social Security reform. I wanted to share this with y'all. It's just going to take me one moment to pull it up again. Excuse me. Because, I talked about earlier how you were seeing all these pictures of oh man, there's so many people in the streets in Cuba. And they're pictures of Argentina or Cairo, right? The amount of lies that go on there are insane, right? And those things are great, and it's great that we have social media to be able to, push back against that. I wanted to point. I wanted to point out. I wanted to point out another example of like kind of propaganda, or just like the way that these things are shown. This is very subtle stuff, and they've been doing this for a while. This specific story, even before the protests. But I wanted to note this because I think it's an interesting way to so obviously it's like insane in manufacturing consent and lies when, they're using like random pictures, right, that aren't even from the country that they're talking about to say like, oh, wow, look at this, right? Someone in the chat, Coral Marks, says CNN showed a picture of Miami. Yeah, you see these kind of things regularly, right? But I wanted to show you an example of another way that they do this that is much more subtle. And this has been let me cut back for 1 second. So they've been talking about this song, this hip hop song that's like finally showing the Castros, and is, representing like the actual will of the Cuban people for a while. And it turns out it's a song that's primarily written and produced by folks in Miami. And they always talk about the amount of views that it's gotten on social media, but, not noting that the vast majority of those views are coming from people who have left Cuba in the 50s because they didn't want to be a part of any kind of left-wing project, hyper-social reactionaries across Latin America, and certainly the pro-regime change, pro-war, pro-intervention camp in the United States. I just want to bring this up because they tell this story a lot, how like this is the real anthem of the people, right? The hip-hop song that's driving Cuba's unprecedented protests. Cuba is suffering through a summer of dire shortages from food and electricity to medicine. Fed up Cubans are taking to the street in unprecedented protests, and they're voicing their outrage through a song called Patria y Vida, Homeland and Life. The slogan is the spin on the communist regime's decades-old slogan, Patria o Muerte, right? Homeland or death. In strong terms, the song accuses the government of destroying the quality of life in Cuba, a message that quickly found traction with protesters demanding change. I can't read through the whole article, but you see the title. You can look it up yourself. The entire story here is about these boys, right? And their song against the government, right? And how it's a hit. And how so many people are loving this song so much and then talking about all the problems in Cuba, right? Never do they make this. Do they justify this claim that this song is the engine of the protests, right? And they were doing this shit about 4 months ago, and I wish I had it. But I remember reading about it in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times about how music is like now the way that this fight is being fought. And if you read it very carefully, they even admit in the original articles 4 months ago that they were putting out about this song that it's very unlikely that many people are listening to this song on the island, right? So it's like, okay, so some people make a piece of media for people outside of Cuba who hate the Cuban government and who hate the Cuban project, right? And then you present it as if like this is the heartbeat of the revolution, the heartbeat of the movement, right? This is absurd shit. And I've seen some photographs with the slogan on it now, right? But that's the extent, that we're getting. And it's just an amazing example. There are obviously way more egregious examples of this kind of propaganda nonsense, but it's a great example of how subtle this stuff is, right? And you see a lot of it in the reporting of saying like, well, they blame everything on the embargoes, right? In Cuba, right? Like, so basically they try to undermine the legitimate criticisms of American imperialism against Cuba by acknowledging them, but then, basically knocking the feet out from under them. It's a real joke. Well, let me see, y'all. I think there's some. It's great to see y'all having good conversations in the chat. I'm just trying to make sure I'm not missing anybody. Don Gacino says, "Is Washington scared of Chile going red in December?" It's going to be really interesting to see what happens as this starts to develop in Chile. I mean, the movement there has been so beautiful and so organic. I'm sure that we'll start to see, more and more activities. And I'm sure if I were to be punishing myself a little bit more and reading publications like the Miami Herald, there probably would be more warning signs as well. But, obviously standing in solidarity with the Chilean people as, they move forward. In a way that's very exciting. I think that what Austin Gonzalez says, though, it's undoubted that there is progressive and left-wing momentum across the Americas right now. And that's a great thing because it really weakens the Americans' ability to be able to focus their energies in one direction, which hopefully means that they'll be less effective. But we'll definitely be watching that for sure, and I appreciate the super chat. Let me see, y'all. I really think at the end of the day, and somebody asked me about the DSA, there's tensions between some of the national accounts, posts, and that's when you start to realize is like, how much does this really matter? But regarding the Cuban, what's going on in Cuba right now in organizations like the DSA International Committee. Remember, DSA is pretty much committed to having solidarity with the Cuban people. And I think it's important for national spokespeople to fall in line with that. I think that's something that I think is coming. I think that more and more people are having to express whether or not they stand with Cuba. And I think the people who are refusing to do so or wanting to play devil's advocate on everything are finally being challenged in an effective way, and I think that's really critical. Justin asks, is a collective mindset necessary for a socialist agenda? Um, I'm sorry, I don't know. That's sort of a hard one to know exactly what you mean there, but uh, I think the better way to think about it is class consciousness is to recognize yourself as a member of something bigger than yourself. So I guess you could consider that to be a collective. Let me see. I guess people are coming to have some good, but I don't think that this is. I almost hesitate to bring up the DSA tensions because I think the fact is that the organization is going in one direction, and these are sort of the hiccups and growing pains that come with this kind of more international socialist perspective. Of becoming the authority there. Here we go. Okay. Well, let me. I pitched it. I'll definitely need to cover it. But I pitched it in the thing. I only have a couple minutes here before I have to go. But I did pitch that the question of will centrists watch the world burn? We talked on the Patreon-only think tank, which you can get access to by joining us at patreon.com/leftreckoning. Matt and I talked a little bit about Matt Iglesias and his sort of non-dunk on on the Sunrise Movement. And Matt Iglesias' non-dunk on the Sunrise Movement and basically this kind of defense of Biden's effective non-action on climate. Matt and I talked about this, but if you basically look at the GDP of the United States and you look at what is in this infrastructure bill that was supposed to be, remember, this is what was sold to us. This was supposed to be where they snuck in or brought in the kind of environmental, brought in more green spending, brought in more greening of the economy, started to challenge the fossil fuel industry, right? It was supposed to happen in the infrastructure plan, and it's not. It's just not. And Matty Iglesias got all worked up, trying to make the point. It's like, well, actually, they are spending this much $1 billion on it, right? But at the end of the day, the sums are so small compared to what any reasonable climate scientist says is needed when it comes to spending. And this kind of fixation too on just the price tags alone, I think, is something that people are going to have to learn to be very wary of, because you're seeing things that are like greening of the economy for rich folks, right? I think electric vehicles are important. I think that we need to be building the infrastructure to support them, right? But effectively, kind of throwing pennies at that is just to appease people who own electric vehicles, things like Teslas and the, $60,000 electric, Ford truck that will be coming out soon, right? Again, we need these things. But look at the spending, and is it fundamentally shifting the economy? Is it fundamentally shifting power? It's not. It's very clear that it's not. And if you compare the spending that's in this infrastructure bill to the United States' GDP, it's not even, you can't even register it. So again, we talked about that a little bit more in depth yesterday, but it reminds us of the critical thing. Is one, infrastructure, the point of using the infrastructure bill to pursue, a greening of the economy, green energy projects, etc., is not just some sneaky way to get it in. Every day you make decisions based on what is available to you. Liberals love to make the point and like to turn all these things into individual consumer choices, right? Oh, you drove your car to work, you didn't bike to work. Oh, you're horrible for the environment, right? I'm sorry. People who don't live in communities that have working and efficient public transportation don't have that option. People who don't have safe bike lanes don't have that option. The choice that is made by our government and by organizations that are much larger than us as individuals are what shape the daily consumption habits of people. Infrastructure is one of the most critical aspects that is going to govern individual choices. And they're already walking back all of this shit. And I don't even have time right now, because I really do have to leave in just a moment, to go through what's going on with Schumer and Manchin and this. Now they're talking about having to pay for everything in advance in infrastructure. I mean, it's a complete joke. And the Democratic Party is truly failing. And it would be funny if it weren't going to be so devastating for us all. But I wanted to make that quick point about why the people like Iglesias, who like to try to do nitpicking, saying like, oh, well, Sunrise Movement says that Biden's plan does nothing for climate change. Well, actually, he spends like a little bit of money here and there, right? Those people literally are willing to watch the world burn to be able to try to make cheap points against youth movements against climate change. Absolutely disgusting. But I wanted to note this as well, because this is very, very shocking. This is in the Los Angeles Times. U.S. drilling approvals increased despite Biden climate pledge. And this is from Matthew Brown in the Associated Press. Approvals for companies to drill for oil and gas on United States public lands are on pace this year to reach their highest level since George W. Bush was president, underscoring President Biden's reluctance to more forcefully curb petroleum production in the face of industry and Republican resistance. The Interior Department approved about 2,500 permits to drill on public and tribal lands in the first 6 months of the year, according to an Associated Press analysis of government data. That includes more than 2,100 drilling approvals since Biden took office January 20th. New Mexico and Wyoming had the largest number of approvals. Montana, Colorado, and Utah had hundreds each. It's inexcusable to sit here and have to read headlines and stories like that, right? The Believe Science crowd, for all of their shit, right? About, oh, well, we read books. And, we read The New Yorker. And if you sit here and are still defending a political organization, a political party, and a political movement that is doing this to the planet, and you believe the science, God save your soul, right? I mean, that is the biggest bad faith argument I can imagine, to say, oh, well, we're the good ones because we believe the science, and yet we will continue to approve the pillaging of this planet. We are going to continue to walk back proposals that were too modest in the first place. Walk them back until they become just decimal points on a bill, right? It is unbelievably disgusting that we're still having this conversation as we are getting dire warnings from scientists about how serious this climate change is. That it's now, I mean, some of the reports that have been coming out for the past couple of weeks have been saying things like, it's worse than we ever thought. And we thought it was bad as hell before. And you have people still willing to play this game with the oil industry. There has to be a fundamental shift. And that it's hard. It's really hard. And I'll tell you one thing it can't be. It can't be all of us just looking at the doom and destruction and relishing in the failures of the Democratic Party. We have to build something else. And it has to be something that's built in reality and is not just built on a kind of sense of like moral opposition. Oh, I'm smarter and I'm better. And like, well, the world might burn, but you know what? At least I could say I wipe my hands clean of that shit. It's like, no, politics is tough. Building these kind of coalitions is going to be difficult, but we have to start doing it and doing it seriously and not allowing people on our side, I'm talking about the left socialist side, to treat politics as a space for them just to do moral witness. Fine. I understand, like, I get pissed about this shit too. But it's really not a game. And we have to, despite all of the terror that we get from that, understand that we have to can never allow ourselves to fall into a kind of panic mindset, right? Because if we fall into a panic mindset, we won't be able to build the structures that are necessary, for example, in 5 years to be doing something different, right? I'm not even talking about electoral calendars. I'm talking about building organizations that can organize our power as working people and as socialists in a way that we can functionally use to challenge and change these people, right? Sometimes in elections and sometimes through other means, right? But that's the work that needs to be done. And it's the work that I know a lot of people are working really hard trying to do it. But we really have to be doing a hell of a lot more. I spent my frustration. I'm just going to share this with y'all. To Biden boosted a pipeline. Now his aide could reap a windfall. Regulators sound alarm as Biden's advisor owns a big stake in a company whose pipeline was backed by the administration. Now she'll qualify for a special tax break. It's, what can you say? Thanks to the folks at Daily Poster for exposing this kind of thing. It's definitely not being covered and talked about enough. That's the coalition. That's where that coalition really does end, though. It's bottom line shit. They can posture all they want about climate change. They can posture all they want about belief science, right? The Republicans are certainly a death cult. But what do you call it when the people who are supposedly the ones who take this shit seriously are doing that? Eat vegetables, probably some good advice. I'm too hot and bothered right now. Says, thanks for the stream. Really appreciate your clarity on the material culture war and what we have to do. I certainly appreciate it as well. I don't know why I'm in trouble for not bringing up Trump. I haven't been watching the Trump channel, so he's not in power right now. It has been funny to see the cucks in the Republican Party, though, all polling at 1%. Very frightening, though, to see. That probably means he's going to be running again. Well, y'all, tomorrow at 7 Central, Matt and I will be here again for another Left Reckoning show. We're going to be joined by Victor Puggi, who's going to be talking about Bolsonaro, the fight against COVID there, an extreme scandal. If people haven't seen this yet, it's really something else. Bolsonaro, somebody who came into power, allegedly fighting corruption in Brazil, which is obviously a complete joke from the get-go, now is wrapped up in an extreme scam to basically skim copious amounts of money off of the top of vaccine purchases for Brazil on an Indian vaccine that has not really been tested, despite the fact that Bolsonaro has refused time and time again to accept other vaccine alternatives when he had the chance. Looking forward to talking to Victor about that, talking about the future of Lula and the movements there. We'll definitely be talking about a few more. Please send us any stories that are happening in your communities, hometowns, or states. We definitely want to get back in the habit of covering what's going on across the country as much as we can. There's obviously a lot to talk about, so it's not always easy to get to everything. But even if we don't cover on the show, I always like hearing what y'all are seeing. We'll talk to y'all later. Please consider joining us at patreon.com/leftreckoning to get access to the post games and our bonus episodes as well. Take care, all of y'all.